Welcome to Only for Your Ears, and today's episode 33, A Leaf from Heaven by Hans Christian Andersen, which I've renamed as This Precious Jewel Falls into the Wrong Hands. The structure will remain the same, starting off with a summary where I'll highlight the most important points or sentences with a digress and then a reflection. Then we'll move on to my critical review on how I see this story, fairy tale, and how it plays in today's society. And last but not least, the trigger points. The points or the triggers that affected me and why they did. So let's begin with A Leaf from Heaven, or as I renamed it as This Precious Jewel Falls into the Wrong Hands, is a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen that tells the story of a heavenly plant that sprouts in a forest after an angel drops a leaf from the garden of heaven. I digress. This must be a magical gift from the ethers. The other plants in the forest, such as thistle and nettles, mock the strange plant. Typical. I digress again. Unfortunately, this is a typical response from even people who love nature on Earth, and even a professor of botany cannot classify it in his system. I digress. It just goes to show not everything needs to be classified in order to have value. Reflections, the limits of human knowledge. The story highlights the limitations of human knowledge, as neither the plants in the forest nor the professor of botany can fully comprehend the heavenly plant's nature. I digress. Of course, if there's something we don't understand academically or can make sense out of, we deem it as strange or something we can't identify with, which becomes unclassified. This serves as a reminder that there are things in the world that are beyond our understanding and that we should approach them with humility and respect. I digress. Bravo. One day, a poor innocent girl with a pure heart and deep faith comes across the plant. She is captivated by its beauty and fragrance and takes a single green leaf from it, placing it in her Bible. I digress. It takes a young girl to recognize the beauty of this unique plant without judgment when nobody else could. The girl dies a few weeks later, and the leaf is buried with her, remaining evergreen and unfading. I digress. The purpose of this girl is the celebration of her faith and her ability to recognize heavenly beauty. She had completed her mission on this planet, as far as I'm concerned. And just because something is different, it doesn't mean it's weird. Reflection, the power of faith. The poor girl's deep faith and pure heart allow her to appreciate the heavenly plant's beauty and significance. I digress. Whereas us mere mortals couldn't see the significance of the plant and its uniqueness, while others fail to recognize its value. She experiences a spiritual connection to the plant. I digress. Her connection with her deep faith means she experienced a spiritual moment that touched her life with, with the heavenly kingdom. This suggests that faith can help people see and appreciate the divine in the world around them. I digress. This is true even if it is from somewhere else we cannot fathom. Meanwhile, the king of the country is plagued by melancholy. This is typical for him. And a wise man suggests that a leaf from the heavenly plant will cure him. That's if he has any faith at all. I digress. How interesting. The same leaf that transitioned the little girl to heaven could cure the king? You mean this strange, unclassifiable plant could be of value after all? This calls into question faith. What we believe is true for us, we can develop faith in. So the wise man perceived the various forms of power the plant possessed, but the plant has been uprooted and destroyed by a swineherd who didn't know its value. Typical. I digress. Isn't it always the way on the planet Earth? We don't understand something of value, so we destroy it. It's so typical. The king, in despair, visits, visits the spot where the plant once stood. I digress. It's amazing how life is, isn't it? We deem something as strange that we can't classify, and then once once it's gone, we recognize its value far too late. The king declares it's sacred and installs a sentry to guard it day and night. I digress. Pitiful. Reflection. This should have been guarded when it was initially recognized as unique. The graveyard of the little girl who died should have been deemed sacred as she plucked from the tree, as she plucked the leaf from the tree that is still alive. The professor of botany is rewarded for his work on the plant, hypocrite. I digress. This is so hypocritical. The professor once deemed it as an unclassifiable and strange, and now he receives an award for his hard work. But the king remains as melancholic as ever. I digress. It sounds like the king didn't have any real intention to improve his temperament, for the plant's miraculous properties lie forgotten in the dead girl's Bible. I digress. This powerful and blessed gift from heaven remains ignorant amongst the people's hands it fell into. What a beautiful story. And this is a typical reflection of how human beings are actually on earth. If we see something, we can't classify it, we can't label it, we can't discriminate it, we can't judge it. We deem it as not valuable, and then we throw it away. And then after it's gone, we praise it. Now for my critical review on how this story plays in today's society. This story is the history of my existence, which I've been struggling with all my life. It reminds me of how comfortable we feel in what's familiar to us, as if we see something as incomprehensible to our little corner of the world we live in. We deem it as unworthy, a bit like one person's trash is another person's treasure. It's sad that the only character in the fairy tale who recognizes the true beauty of this leaf from heaven, which grows into a different kind of plant, is a faithful yet innocent religious 8-year-old girl. That's because children haven't grown into society's condition of what's acceptable and unacceptable by mainstream collective called a society. Children are more open and, yes, innocent. than the jaded adults who have used discrimination as a means to develop our principles, power of who we are from a character perspective. We tend to follow the tribe mentally of if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. I think we can still identify with what is considered acceptable without having to isolate and ostracize someone as being strange, weird, which is code for not normal. It, in a TED Talk, Weird or Just Different, Derek Sivers gives a clear and precise explanation of this in just 2 minutes by using street addresses in the USA and Japan to compare and contrast their differences and similarities. It's very effective speech that gives us comprehension without making people feel uncomfortable about their personal differences that might ruffle people's feathers. But let's move on to some examples to frame my review. The first one, I digress, of course. If there's something we don't understand academically or can make sense out of, we deem it as strange or something we can't identify, which becomes unclassified. My first example is a Russian film about Baron Munchausen, who tries to forsake who he is as a person to fit into society. The film begins on May 30, 1779, in Hanover, Germany. Baron Munchausen is seen as a liar who lives in a world of pure fantasy. However, the unbelievable stories he shares somehow seem to always be true. The film begins on May 30th, 1779, in Hanover, Germany. Baron Munchausen is seen as a liar who lives in a world of pure fantasy. However, uh, the stories he shares somehow seem to always be true. So he lives in a total fantasy world. But, I believe that fantasies in some way have elements of the truth in them. Let's continue with this example. Let's continue. I have to pause. The Baron lives in a castle, and his lover Martha, they have a long wanted to get married, but there's one problem. Murchison already has a wife. Thankfully, though, the Duke soon agrees to Murchison's petition of divorce. However, a scandal emerges when Murchison dates his divorce documents as May 32nd. He does this because he has calculated astronomically that the calendar that year, the film begins on May 30, 1779, in Hanover, Germany. Baron Munchausen is seen as a liar who lives in a world of pure fantasy. However, the unbelievable stories he shares somehow seem always to be true an extra day. This enrages seemingly everyone. The Duke court is so irate that it refuses to approve the divorce. Caving under pressure from the court as well as the public, Martha and Murchison renounce all his fantastical stories. Following that, he burns all his manuscripts and shoots himself. Or at least that's what everyone believes has, have, has passed since the official death of Murchison. During this time, he has become a celebrity, proclaimed as a great man, misunderstood by his contemporaries. 3 years have passed since the official death of Murchison. During this time, he has become a celebrity, proclaimed as a great man, misunderstood by his contemporaries. However, he's still alive, working under the name Mullah. This man is absolutely not well. At a flower shop with his lover, now wife Martha. Despite achieving his romantic goal, Murchison is miserable. He has transformed into a sullen cynic that Martha can no longer bear to be with, so Martha leaves him. This brings into question an undeniable pure faith the little girl had in the fairy tale, which is considered a universal truth and is in the Bible, which has fantastical stories of miracles I haven't seen, but I believed happen. And Murchison's fantastical stories are contrived through his what he believed, but he believes them for the convenience of his creative life he wants to have. But if you believe it's true for you, you can develop faith in it. However, Murchison doesn't have the following Jesus Christ had. I think in the book of John, in the Bible, it says the people, will believe and develop faith once they see the miracles which they did. With Murchison, he never produced miracles, even though truth did come out of his fantasies, but he created great stories. He was a storyteller who not only lived in his fantasies, but lived for them. That's why he gets depressed when he has to return to being Mullah. It's like society. Martha and his relatives will not accept him without the other aspect of the man, working under the name Mullah. Both characters are an integral part of who he is. That's why it's futile to try and change the integral part of human beings just because we don't like a certain part of who they are. It's amazing when they think the Baron is dead, they called him a great man. This is the direct reflection of what happens in the fairy tale with the plant that they label as sacred once it's gone, which is what happens in society today. Look at Jesus Christ. We don't recognize the value of something we didn't understand until we don't have it anymore. Let's move on to the confused genius. I digress. Of course, if there's something we don't understand academically or can make sense out of, we deem it as strange or something we can't identify with, which becomes unclassifiable or unclassified. Vincent van Gogh, one of my favorite artists, was a Dutch impressionist who is amongst the most famous and influential figures in the history of Western art. In just over a decade, he created approximately 2,100 artworks, including around 860 oil paintings, most of them in the last 2 years of his life. Amazing. They include landscapes, still lifes, portraits, self-portraits, especially the famous one with his ear cut off, and are characterized by bold, symbolic colors and dramatic, impulsive, and highly expressive brushwork that contributed to the foundation of modern art today. Only one of his paintings was known by name to have been sold during his lifetime. What a pity. Van Gogh became famous after his suicide, aged 37, which followed years of poverty and mental illness. Born into an upper class family, Van Gogh drew as a child and was serious, quiet, and thoughtful, but showed signs of mental instability. As a young man, he worked as an art dealer, often traveling, but became depressed after he was transferred to London. He turned to religion and spent time as a missionary in southern Belgium. Later, he drifted into ill health and solitude. He was keenly aware of his modernist trends in art, and while back with his parents, took up painting in 1881. His younger brother Theo supported him financially, and the two of them kept up long correspondence by letters. Van Gogh's art critic, gained critical recognition after his death, and his life story captured public imagination as an emblem of misunderstood genius, due in large part to the efforts of his widowed sister in law, Joanna van Gogh Bogner. The Dutch artist Rembrandt favored in Holland more than Van Gogh. This was mainly for his technique and incredible skills in drawing, painting, and printing. He was recognized as a great technician, whereas Van Gogh wasn't. I think his mental instability was a large part of the public's retreat from truly honoring him. I also think the Dutch people's refusal to recognize his talent could have been a contributing factor to his low self esteem, which increased his mental illness. He became a valuable artist, and his work made millions after his death. It's almost as though, oh, good, he's dead. We can support and admire this crazy genius. You know, he's brilliant, but we didn't feel safe to admire his work when he was alive. So he had to die first, and then everybody went crazy and bought all of his paintings. So sad. Poor and undervalued artists. It's so pitiful. There's so many artists that die poor and undervalued. I digress. The purpose of this girl is the celebration of her faith and her ability to recognize heavenly beauty. She had completed her mission on this planet, and just because something is different, it doesn't mean it's weird. Jean Michel Basquiat was born December 22, 1960, and died August 27, 1988, was an American artist who rose to success during the 1980s as part of the Neo-Expressionism movement. Basquiat first achieved notoriety in the late 1970s as part of the graffiti movement, writing enigmatic poetry all over Manhattan, particularly in the cultural hotbed of the Lower East Side, where rap and punk and street art coalesced in early hip hop music culture. By the early 1980s, by the early 19 In the early 1980s, his paintings were being exhibited in galleries and museums internationally. At 21, Besquet became the youngest artist to ever take part in the Documenta in Kassel, Germany. At 22, he was one of the youngest to exhibit at the Whitney Biennale in New York. The Whitney Museum of American Art held a retrospective of his artwork in 1992. Besquet's art focused on diametrics such as wealth versus poverty, integration versus segregation, and inner versus outer experiences. He, he appropriated poetry, drawing, and painting, and married text with and image. Anyway, in 1988, Besquet's work was steadily increased in value, and in 2017, his work was worth at least $110.5 million, even though he died totally poor. This is rich people. He was denied ever experiencing the kind of wealth and recognition society, shunning him this kind of talent only to be riddled with guilt when the artist can never enjoy this and forever labeled as poor. Artists are not stupid. They're just they just have sensitive imaginations and are extremely taken advantage of by big businesses using their work to push political and other interests by gaining influence to manipulate the general public. So those are my three examples as far as my critical review. You have the imaginary Baron Munchausen, you have Van Gogh, and then you have John Michael Basquiat. They were all underrated, incredible artists, and people did not feel safe to acknowledge them until after they died. Now for the trigger points. What triggered me was a deep realization of a need to get people's approval. So what is approval? Let's take a look at this. As nouns, the difference between approval and recognition. Approval is an expression granting permission, an indication of agreement with a proposal, an acknowledgement that a person, thing, or event meets requirements, while recognition is the act of recognizing or the condition of being recognized. So I strived so hard to get people's approval at any length. My self-esteem depended on this. I would slump into periods of feeling down simply because I couldn't accept myself at all without others' approval. I was conditioned by society's sense of what was normal through mainstream media, culture, and tradition. Being a sensitive artist with unique ideas was met with little approval or recognition because because my imagery was outside the box and still is today, probably. It didn't matter how much I tried to be like everybody else. That wasn't accepted either. Even my dance and my art teachers wouldn't accept this, but didn't know what to do with it, with it being unique. How I changed from being addicted to approval and recognition to the more stable, creative thinker and person I am today. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination putting myself in the same class as Van Gogh. But I believe, as well as his mental instability, he suffered from society's inability to approve of him, if not as a person, an artist. The two things are the same for me, although most people disagree. And I think the public's recognition of Rembrandt's more traditional, technical, creative expression, whereas not whereas not really accepting Van Gogh was a tremendous blow to his self-esteem, which led him to flee Holland and find his home in Provence. It didn't just have to it didn't just have to do with preference, but a fear of recognizing something as different, even though it wasn't their taste. This is clear from the tremendous fame and incredible wealth his work accumulated after his death. The times had changed, but not only that, significantly after Van Gogh's suicide. I believe the personality is an integral part of what an artist produces. Not everybody believes this. The fundamental internal makeup expresses itself on the external stage in society in different ways or different types of reality. Self love was and is the main ingredient of my self discovery and ability to free myself of the imprisonment and addiction to people's opinion, approval, and recognition. Today, I feel totally free to express myself creatively without seeking people's approval. It took a lot of hard work and inner child healing. I also had something else that triggered me was looking at the church or looking at different institutions like schools. You know, you if you go to a school, if you go to a church, if you go to a club, a group of people, they have their favorites. And there's nothing wrong with having a favorite. I personally don't like the idea of having favorites or being somebody's favorite because there's a lot of manipulation that's involved with that. But I will say, from what I experienced when I was at church, it was easy for them to encourage and like their favorites as opposed to really accepting the real talent of somebody else that was unique and different. Because again, when it comes, it's a bit like the leaf, a bit like Van Gogh, a bit like John Michael Bisquet, and on and on. It's safer to like somebody that is like somebody's work that's conventional, as opposed to openly admitting that you like somebody's work that is perceived as unconventional. It's only safe to like their work when maybe they've left the environment and you could say, oh, I really liked that person's work. Or when the person's dead and you could say, oh, what a pity. I really liked his work. Wasn't he a talented person? And this is when people feel safe. We only feel safe when it's something that is familiar to us. When it's something that's unusual, we run away and our fear takes over. The last one, underestimated lyricist. And this is George Harrison, the real songwriter behind all of these, the famous Beatles. Ringo Starr, John Lennon. Well, Ringo Starr didn't really write that many songs, to be quite honest. He had one or two concerts that didn't go down very well. Um, John Lennon, and Paul McCartney. The, the most incredible and underestimated songwriter was George Harrison. He was the real songwriter and probably poet as well. He was incredibly underestimated. And I remember when he branched out on his own, he created this song called My Sweet Lord. And it was just after he had, I don't know, he had seen the Dalai Lama. He went to India and it completely changed his life. And he became completely just spiritual for the rest of his life. And he came back and he wrote this song, My Sweet Lord, and I really want to see you. And it was at #1 in England for about 13 to 14 weeks, 3 months. It was incredible. Uh, and it's not until he died that people recognized how incredible he truly, truly was. So those are my triggers. And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And I would like to say, don't forget to share and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and give me a like. And I'm going to close off with healing is a lifelong blessing, lesson, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Until another time, until next week, goodbye and take care.